Hi everyone, welcome to today's Java tutorial. Today we're going to have an introduction to object-oriented programming. Today's scenario is the development of a game called Barmy Farmers. And in the game there are going to be 3 farmers, and each farmer will have a name, a score, and a bankruptcy status. Now, the dilemma for programmers is how to manage each farmer's data. Okay, this farmer here has 3 items of data related specifically to him. This farmer here has 3 items of data specifically related to him, etc., etc. So let's look at strategy number 1 for managing this data. The first strategy is simply to create individual variables to manage the name of each farmer, the score of each farmer, and the bankruptcy status of each farmer. That's one strategy, and it's a perfectly fine strategy. And now that we've got our initial data set up, we can continue to code the game logic. Strategy number 2 is also a very reasonable strategy. Create some arrays to store different data related to the game, and then you can continue to code the game logic. Strategy number 3 is one of the most interesting strategies. Strategy number 3 would be to construct 3 new farmer objects in computer memory, and each farmer object is going to store a string, which is the name, an integer, which is the score, and a boolean, which is the bankruptcy status. So when we construct a new farmer object, we give it some starter data, and then later we can change that data as the game is being played. Interestingly, we need a variable which will help us communicate with that digital object in computer memory. And also, the data type of this variable is, well, it's not an int, and it's not a string. This is a farmer. The data type is farmer. And Joe, this variable, is communicating with a farmer object in computer memory, and that object is storing 3 items of data. Jack, similarly, is a variable which is also farmer data type, and it is referencing a farmer object in computer memory. This object also stores a string, an integer, and a boolean. Notice the values may be different in each of these objects, but the properties are the same. We have a name, a score, and a bankruptcy status, and all of our farmer objects will have those 3 properties. Okay? We can also see that this thing here looks like a function. I think it's a function because it's got round brackets. And this function accepts 3 arguments, a string, an int, and a boolean. And I'm imagining that when we construct a new farmer object in computer memory, these 3 arguments will be stored inside the object, and later, in our game logic, we will be able to mess around with the scores and mess around with the bankruptcy statuses. How is this possible? Let's jump into our IDE and just try and set a few things up. So I've already created my Barmy Farmers project area, and I've got my main function here. I'm just going to type out very quickly the code that we were just looking at. We're going to construct a new farmer object in computer memory, and when we construct that farmer object, we're going to give it some starter information. Okay, so there's one farmer that we've constructed. Let's construct Jack, which is also referencing a farmer object in computer memory, a string, an integer, and a boolean. Now I'm only giving each farmer a score of 0 and a bankruptcy status of false because at the beginning of the game the score will be 0, and I'm sure at the beginning of the game the farmer isn't bankrupt yet, so that's why I'm doing it like that. It could be that at the start of the game Jill's score is 10 for some reason. Of course that's possible. Now Java is complaining because farmer cannot be resolved to a type. There is no data type called farmer. This is just something from my imagination. So what's the solution to this problem? Well, I'm going to design this data type, actually. And inside this data type there will be 3 properties: a string, an integer, and a boolean. And also inside this data type there will be the definition of this function here, which is the farmer function. Okay? Now to do this I'm going to have to create a new class. I'm going to call my class farmer because that's the name of this data type. It doesn't have the main function, that's just for my computer program. This is just a separate entity. And here we have it. Now the first thing I'm going to do is to declare properties. And we know that every farmer has a string, an integer, and a boolean. The string represents the farmer's name, so I'm just going to call it name. The integer represents the farmer's score, so I'm just going to call it score. And the boolean represents the farmer's bankruptcy status, so I'm just going to call it bankrupt to save me a bit of typing. Then I need to define that strange looking function that we saw. Do you remember it? Whenever we construct a new farmer object, we need to call this function. And remember, it accepts a string, an integer, and a boolean as parameters. Okay? So let's do that. Public what? Public void? I don't think it returns anything, so we'll just do public void for now. It accepts a string, an integer, and a boolean as parameters. Now I need to give each of these a name. I know that the string represents the farmer's name. I know that the integer represents the farmer's score, and I know that the boolean represents the bankruptcy status. To be honest with you, I can't be bothered thinking of new variable names. I'm just going to use these ones: name, score, and bankrupt. Will this work? What I want to do is assign this parameter to this class variable here. This is a class variable. So I could say name is assigned name. But Java's confused because I gave them the same identifier. So to solve that problem, I can use the this keyword. This .name means this class's property will be assigned the parameter name. So that solves that problem. And we'll do the same for score and bankrupt. So we're simply assigning these parameters to these class variables. So when we construct the object, that data will be assigned to these variables and it will be safe. Brilliant. We still have an error, and let me try to explain the error. In order to construct a farmer object, we need to call this function. This function has the same name as the class. This is a very special function. I'm not going to call it the strange-looking function anymore. I'm going to call it the constructor method. Now, method really just means function. But when you're designing your own classes, you will find yourself using the word method more than function. And the constructor method of a class is very special. We don't even need to say that it doesn't return anything. We just say public and then the identifier, which is the same as the name of the class. And that's it. Let's go back to our computer program. Do we still have some issues? Yes, we do. What is the issue with this one? The constructor farmer string int boolean is undefined. Really? Farmer Jill equals new farmer Jill. Why is that giving me a headache? String int boolean farmer. It looks okay to me. Let's just delete this for a minute. Let's do it again. Farmer Jill equals new farmer string int boolean. String int boolean. Okay, I'm not sure why we were getting an error before, but anyway, that seems to work. Now let's do this. System.out.println. Look at these variables. These variables are so useful because they help us to communicate with these objects. And we know inside each object we have some properties. So let's use the Joe variable to communicate with this object, and let's just check what its score is. Let's look at the property of the Joe variable. It's 0. Okay. Let's do this. Let's say, okay, Joe.score equals Joe.score plus 1. Let's just do that and just see if we can change data that's being stored inside an object. So I'm going into the Joe object, I'm finding its score property, and I'm just updating it. And let's see if that works. Whoa! Okay. So this is an introduction to object-oriented programming. And as you can see, we are encapsulating properties and methods into a single class file to help us manage our data. As you continue to study object-oriented programming, you will understand how powerful, convenient, and generally useful this approach is.